How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, this is going to be an exciting one. I have retired Sheriff Rick Singleton. He is the author of Manhunt, The Search for Vicky and Casey White, the grip and true crime saga. If you guys are familiar with this case, looks like there could have been a little love involved. Retired Sheriff Rick Singleton was the top dog during that whole incident. He is going to share with us stories, details, and I just think there's a great lesson to be learned here. Just basically, I think anybody could be vulnerable to manipulation. So this is very geared towards my interest, and I'm really looking forward to breaking bread with the person who was behind the scenes handling it. Before I introduce him real quick, remember, guys, I have two books that are on the market: Inmate Manipulation Decoded. This book has sold thousands of copies. Thank you guys for your continued support. It's found on Amazon. And then I have this book published by Blue 360 Media, the #1 publishing company for all law enforcement. It's called How to Succeed in Corrections. It's a manual that just got tons of advice for those working in the profession, not just for myself, but from others as well. And then I have a partnership book coming out that's going to team up with this same publisher, Blue 360 Media, and that should be out the beginning of next year. Link to that is also in the description. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring on the retired sheriff. He's going to introduce himself, and then I'm going to showcase two videos real quick just to kind of give you guys a reminder of the incident that happened in April. And then we're going to go ahead and dive deep into the book, the story. We're going to talk about everything from the escape to the capture. And also have a lot of followers here from Duty Ron who are true crime experts. So I think that they're definitely going to enjoy this show. I'm kind of doing it for them as well. And I think for our perspective, those in the profession, just a lot of things from policy and procedure all the way to manipulation. I really do think this was a great dialogue for all of us. So let me get in retired Sheriff Rick Singleton. What's up, Rick?
Nothing much. A little cold down here in the South.
Yeah, you're up in Alabama, right?
Yeah, I had to break away from the game to get with you here, but that's all right.
So if you don't mind, Sheriff, do you mind introducing yourself to our audience and kind of letting us know your history? What made you, get into law enforcement, and then obviously becoming a sheriff down the line over the jail where this all happened?
Yeah, I actually began my career in 1972, and my first job was what we call back then a jailer in the county jail, a corrections officer. I was 21 years old, and I spent about 4 months as a corrections officer before I went on the road as a deputy sheriff of the Lauderdale County Sheriff's Office, and that was a little over 50 years ago. Spent about 5 years with the sheriff's office. I ran for sheriff when I was 26 years old, like I thought I was qualified, and of course wasn't elected, so I went to work with the Florence Police Department, rose through the ranks. 16 years later, after I went to work there, I was chief of police. I served as chief of police for 16 years. Retired from the police department and then ran for sheriff again in 2014. I was elected, ran unopposed in 2018, and retired at the end of my second term in January this year.
Well, let me thank you for your service. But I got to ask you, you worked on the streets, you oversaw a prison. What are the major differences between both?
Well, municipal policing is all about law enforcement per se. The sheriff's office, the responsibilities are much more diverse. In addition to the law enforcement responsibilities, here in the South, the sheriff is the head law enforcement officer of the county. And so we have all the authority of law enforcement officers in general. But on top of that, of course, we have court security, we have the jail to run, we have a civil process to take care of, extradition, inmate transports, those kinds of things that we didn't have to deal with as police department.
I know for us, we long time ago when I did this channel, I really did it to show people that we should be considered equals in the eyes of the law enforcement. I want people to know that we all work together. We complete that circle. There's a partnership. And it's great to know that right now, I believe that we have evolved to where people are starting to see us in that fashion. They're starting to see us as that completion. Now, I know this case has got a lot going on. I was actually invited on the news a few times as well to talk about the manipulation aspect. And I was very fascinated by this. Right off the bat, when I first saw the case, again, I didn't know Vicky White, but I did feel that she was manipulated. And I did feel right off the bat that she may have fell in love with Casey White, and that's why she did what she did. But I know for people that worked next to her, it was a lot harder for them to believe because all they saw was this professional. A professional was given a lot of authority in her efforts to run the prison. But the reason why I think this story really matters is because if someone at that high level could be manipulated, then I feel that pretty much anybody could be vulnerable to the process of manipulation. Again, I believe I believe manipulation is very situational. It's based on what the individual could be going through, and then how inmates can react based on the needs or impulses of that individual. And I know, obviously, if I may ask, this case brought a lot of attention to your facility, which I don't know, what was your facility ever in the news like this before?
Not something like this. Of course, we had escapes before. We had what, and when this case was going on, there was a lot of talk about he didn't escape. He was let out of jail. And that's true, technically. But as you and I both know, that's still an escape. We haven't had a physical breakout at our facility since 2016. Our facility is not that old, really. It was opened in 1996, not quite 30 years ago. It was built for 150 inmates. The maximum capacity when I was in office, we had 408 inmates in that facility. It had been modified over the years to the point that we had 256 beds. But at one time we had 408 inmates. So that was one of the factors. I talk about in the book how this was sort of a perfect storm. There were a lot of factors. Obviously, we had a vulnerable employee in Vicky White. We had a master manipulator in Casey White. Vicky White, due to her position, had all the opportunities in the world to pull something like this off. But a lot of other issues going on inside the jail itself that Vicky was very much aware of and used to her advantage was a shortage of manpower. That's something we struggled with the entire time I was sheriff. I think in my 8 years as sheriff, I think we were at full staff in our jail 2 days. The turnover rate's just astronomical, as you know. The pay is pitiful. I don't know. It's getting better, but still, when I went into office, I literally had corrections deputies selling blood to get money to pay their bills. That's what they were paying them, poverty wages. So all that comes into play. You're short-handed. You have a constant turnover. You've got inexperienced deputies working the floor, and I go into more detail about how that played in to enable this to happen in the first place.
Yeah, because I remember in the book, which was a great book, guys, if you get a chance, read it. It's detailed, very specific, very quick and to the point. There's just so many lessons. And I love at the end how you talked about the things you had to correct, which I love. I love how you embraced the vulnerability of that all, knowing that, hey, you know what? Lesson learned. Let's make this all work for something, and then go ahead and correct what needs to be corrected. But when it came to the staffing, it says that obviously you were under, I believe you needed over 40 to run the shift and you were down to somewhere around 30.
Yeah, we were allotted 42 corrections deputy slots. We had 33 on April the 29th of 2022. There again, because of her position and authority that Vicky had, we had 4 deputies already had left the facility transporting a dozen inmates to the courthouse. Our correction center is about 5 blocks from the courthouse where all the trials take place and court hearings. And so she had already sent 2 transport vans with 2 deputies each and a total of 12 inmates to the courthouse for court hearings. So that left in the main facility, we had 2 correction deputies working the halls with about 300 inmates. The one deputy that she instructed to go get Casey White, prepare him for transport, had been on the job 2 months. After this broke loose, he felt, I guess he just felt like he's thrown in the limelight and didn't like it. He resigned less than a week after this happened. So that's just some of the things that we have to deal with in the corrections industry business. Is the turnover, the lack of training. When you're short 11 people, it's hard to pull people off shift to get them training that they need. I'm a big proponent of online training. But there again, you have to pay if they do that on their off time. We have to compensate them for that, and so the overtime budget's always something the commissioners are, constantly on our back about overtime. So it's just a vicious cycle.
Right. And her title, I mean, you had two people at that level. One was administratively in charge of the facility, and the other one was in charge through safety and security, correct?
Operational, yes. Mm-hmm.
Operational. And she was more on the operational side. So is she the one that kind of oversaw also the development of policies and procedures?
She certainly played a role in developing policies and procedures and making sure that they were taught to new employees. There again, the opportunities, the new officer that went and retrieved Casey to prepare him that morning. I doubt that they'd even had time to go over the transport policy with him. I doubt if he even knew what the policy was. He'd only been there 2 months, and that wasn't one of his duties to transport inmates. So, that would have been at the bottom of the totem pole as far as things that he needed to learn right out of the gate. So he probably wasn't even aware of what the transport policy was, that there were supposed to be 2 deputies carry Casey White. Even if he did, 2 months on the job, he's not going to challenge the assistant director.
Yeah, when we first saw this, let me ask a question. Do your officers go to an academy before they get certified to work into the facility?
Not in corrections, but we have a 2-week academy in Alabama for corrections deputies. It's not mandatory. It's optional. We tried for the 8 years I was sheriff, we tried to get as many deputies as we could. But when you're running short of staff, like I said earlier, if you pull somebody away for 2 weeks for training, then that means somebody's got to make up the overtime. Right. Even though they work 12-hour shifts, 7 out of 14 days. But when they have to come in on their off days continuously, they get burnt out. They resign, they leave, they get fed up. Then it just, like I said, it's just a vicious cycle. I think I know what part of the answer is, but it comes down to you got to pay them a decent salary, and you can't work them to death. And I tell you, our corrections officers are they're the most underappreciated component of our criminal justice system. People just do not understand what they have to put up with day in and day out.
Yeah, we tell people, like, obviously we stress the importance of an academy at first, but we know that a lot of places are not in a position to do that. Unfortunately, lately we've been hiring more out of desperation, more quantity than quality. And then when you start putting people on the floor without that basic knowledge of how a prison runs, they actually start adapting themselves to practices and not necessarily policy and procedure. So granted, if they're working next to people that are kind of just following things in a more convenient fashion and not really doing as directed by policy, in their mind, this is how it operates. They don't really have enough knowledge to question what's in front of them.
It's changed a lot. It's much better than it was. When I started in 72 as a corrections officer, my training consisted of working 3 8-hour shifts with a veteran corrections officer. That 4th shift I came into work, I was on midnight shift, worked by myself in a jail with 100+ inmates for anything from public intoxication to capital murder. And we had 1 corrections officer on duty, and that 3rd shift. But I'll never forget that the end of that 3rd shift, I worked with Deputy Darby. He told me, pulled me aside. He said, if you hadn't heard anything else I've told you this last 3 days, he said, you listen to what I'm fixing to tell you, and you remembered. He said, the first chance these guys get, they're going to test you. And they're going to see, are you going to run the jail, or are you going to let them run the jail? And the very first morning I worked by myself, I went to feed breakfast at 5:30 in the morning. The first food tray I put in the pigeonhole come flying out. Food went all over the floor, bounced off the wall, went everywhere. And the guys were protesting. They were telling me what they wanted for breakfast. I did something then you couldn't get away with today. I asked them, I said, does anybody in there want breakfast? And of course, nobody would speak up. You know how it goes. So I said, well, fine, you're not getting any. And I just shut the door and went to the other end of the hall, and I opened the door, and I said, the guys on the north end don't want breakfast this morning. You guys want breakfast? And they said, sure. I said, well, you're getting a double serving. So I put all the breakfast trays in there. The next morning, when I went back to the north end, I opened the pigeonhole. I said, do you guys want breakfast this morning? They said, yes, sir. I said, well, fine. So, but if that one piece of advice, if Claude hadn't pulled me aside and said, whatever you do, you hear what I'm fixing to tell you, and I listened. And I was tested the very first day. And every time we hired a corrections deputy at the jail, I told them, and I went overboard. After we finished the interviews and everything, we asked them a question, during the interview. But at the end of the interview, I said, I want to reiterate one thing to you. I said, you are going to be tested more than likely the first day on the job. They're going to want you to bring them a cigarette. They're going to want a piece of chewing gum. They're going to want something they know they're not supposed to have. And the first time you give into it and give it to them, then you're hooked. They've got you over the barrel. So be ready for it mentally. It's going to happen. It's definitely going to happen. Be ready for it. Be prepared for it. And be prepared with your answer that, no, I'm not going down that road. But even with that morning, they still, we still had them do it. But Vicky, of all people, I mean, she'd been working there 17 years. And, she knew. And that you were exactly right. I mean, she was vulnerable. Vicky's problem was she fell in love with this guy. I don't, they always say love's blind. What in the world she saw in him, I don't know. But, for whatever reason, she fell for this guy. He's a master manipulator. He saw her weaknesses. He moved in on them, and we all know how they operate. I tell people they don't call them con men for nothing. And, he targeted her. He moved in on her. He got into her head. And as a result, she did something she would have never, ever even considered doing. But that's what those kind of situations will do to you. Before you know it, you're in.
With that said, let me break into the first video real quick. I have two. I have one where I was brought on real quick to talk about the manipulation process related to this case. And again, guys, I was far removed. I just kind of answered questions based on the experiences that I'm aware of, whether through my training or basically just the stuff I've learned through walking the walk. So let me go ahead and play that video real quick. And then later on, I do want to show a video in which the capture happened. And then we're going to go in between that, we're going to go into the details of the book, and then we're going to create our timeline and just answer questions, hopefully that spread some light onto this story.
And what is really happening behind prison walls? It is something many of us are talking about right now after Casey White escaped from jail in Alabama with the help of corrections officer Vicky White. Now we know the two were in a romantic relationship for about 2 years before being captured in Indiana last week following a car chase. Vicky shot herself, likely took the truth of what really went on between them to the grave. And while you don't hear much about these types of jailhouse relationships, it does not mean that they're not happening, romantic and otherwise. Anthony Gangi has seen it all, and he is the author of the book Correctional Manipulation. Anthony, good to see you tonight. Thank you for being here. So inmate manipulation, there's even a term about some of the games that they play, and you call it downing a duck. What exactly does that mean?
Well, downing a duck is really taking advantage of a staff member that may be a little bit too gullible or naive to the complexity of inmate manipulation. So be advised, when it comes to inmate manipulation, the game is very subtle. And if you go in 100% wanting to help the inmate without being defined by the prescribed roles of the agency, the inmate is going to find a way to take advantage of that want to help.
Well, answer me this. Why are some staff members willing to take that risk? Because I'm sure that they know going in that the risk is there, what's happening behind those walls. What's the most common reason that they get involved with these inmates and help them?
I think their loyalty shifts. I think the inmate gets them to minimize the consequences by building a trust with them. I mean, most of the time, the external incentive not to do something is usually based on not getting caught, which isn't strong enough when inmate is able to challenge that. You need the internal incentive that I'm doing the right thing for the right reasons, as opposed to I'm doing the right thing because I don't want to go to jail. If an inmate is able to minimize that external incentive, if they're able to build the trust and at the end of the day tell you, don't worry, I won't report it, well, now the external justification holds no weight. Now it's more about what your values are. And at that point, if you're basing it on external justifications, there are none.
What are some of the ways that inmates use these relationships, build that trust to their advantage? What do they do?
Well, it's usually slow and subtle. I mean, you're going to look for vulnerabilities. The first thing they're going to check at is someone's disposition, one thing, what is their defined purpose? Can I pull them out of their prescribed role? Can I isolate them? I mean, another thing they look at is the environment. And if you have an environment that isn't complacent, then, inmates are going to say, well, this isn't going to be worth the effort. But if you have an environment that's lax and it kind of shows to be more of a resource, then the problem is you're not setting enough obstacles up to prevent the inmate from employing the game. And one last thing, too, the interaction with inmates have increased a lot more than ever done before. So with that said, with the increased level of interactions, we have to be always on point when it comes to where we're allowing that dialogue to go. If the inmate is able to connect with us on a personal level, it's easier for them to pull us out of our prescribed role because we no longer see them as an inmate because we ourselves no longer see ourselves as defined by the trusted role we're meant to serve.
Anthony, as we look at these pictures of Casey White and Vicky, I'm guessing that you weren't surprised at all that this type of relationship was happening based on what you know. So if it's that widely known that it's taking place, what's being done to stop it? What are the checks and balances and security that need to be readdressed?
Well, right off the bat, when you notice that you have a complacent culture, especially like this with a young lady who's able to take an inmate out on her own, that would be a PREA violation in itself. The first thing you have to do is you have to look at the culture that permits that. So you have to look from the top down because the top is what's going to reinforce the culture that we need to make sure things like this don't happen. So technically, you have to really look at all the practices that were in play because complacency is a unique thing because what happens here, just like manipulation, complacency is slow and subtle. You don't realize you're complacent until, bang, something like this happens. So when complacency starts becoming practice and now you have complacency breeding complacency, you wind up having a culture where this is a very forgiving facility.
Wow, it's eye-opening and it's not rare. And the sheriff in that department there in Florence, Alabama, said the buck stops here. I'm glad we're talking about it because it needs to be addressed. Anthony, appreciate you coming on tonight. Thank you.
My book is this, Inmate Manipulation Decoded. Sorry about that.
You got it.
Yeah, she said the wrong book. That's why I plugged the book. But what I loved about your book is that it embraced the vulnerability of, hey, this is what we got to do to move forward. And also, I love the fact that you were so connected to the case. The information that you were able to provide at the time showed a level of transparency where we were able to build trust back into the top dog. We knew we were in good hands. We knew it was the person that you were the person behind the scenes that was trying to do what was right and not trying to protect their image. And I think the way you handled it, the way you let the public know what was going on, because we do see a lot of escapes. I thought that you embraced that role immediately and filled in whatever knowledge that we needed to have to make sure that, matters were moving forward where they needed to move forward too. Now, I want to kind of get into the story. So again, you wrote the book, which again is an amazing book. If you guys get a chance, I got it on Kindle, but I would probably recommend getting the actual book itself, which I'm going to order. But the book is titled Manhunt, The Search for Vicky and Casey White, The Gripping True Crime Saga. What made you want to write this book?
Well, I'm a history buff. And, there's no question this is probably the most significant historical law enforcement event that's ever happened in our county. It made international news. And we have another story here from the Civil War era. We had an outlaw by the name of Tom Clark, and he supposedly murdered 19 people, including one child. He robbed and stole from people around Lauderdale County and southern Tennessee, all during the war. And he was captured down the west end of Lauderdale County by Marshal Blair, the town marshal in Florence at the time. And he was brought to the county jail and locked up, and a mob busted him out of jail that night, lynched him and his two companions on a tree down in downtown Florence, Alabama. Now, Tom Clark always boasted that nobody would ever run over him. The legend has it that because of that boast, the townspeople buried him under one of the main streets in Florence, and that he's buried there to this day so that every day people run over him because of that boast. We don't know if that's true or not. It's talked about to this day. It's been 150 years. People still talk about that case. I don't know that they'll be talking about this case 100 years from now. I think there's a chance they will be when they start talking about escapes and they say, "Oh yeah, you remember that and happened back in the 2022." And I wanted to make sure the facts were there. That if they are talking about this 100 years from now, they can say, "Well, here's what the sheriff back then said happened." And know that they've got some facts to hang on. And so that's my primary motive, just to preserve the story for the historical significance for future generations. If they have an interest in talking about this particular escape, they'll have some information to go on. And Vicky White, Vicky White was a very controversial subject at the time. And I'll tell you, personally, for me, it was a struggle. For me personally, I mean, I knew Vicky. I thought the world of her. I told someone the other day I loved her like a sister. I considered her a friend, and I just had a really, really hard time wrapping my head around the fact that she would do this intentionally. First, when I first heard that they were gone and nobody had seen them or heard from them, I was afraid she was already dead. I was afraid Casey would have already murdered her during the escape. And, it took me a few days to accept the fact that she helped him get out. When I realized that she wasn't forced, or that he didn't kidnap her or commandeer the car or something, my next thought was, well, somebody got to her family and threatened them, because Casey, he had alleged that he was hired to kill Connie Ridgway back in 2015. That's why he was in our jail to start with, for that murder. And, he claimed that he was hired to do that. Well, being a law enforcement officer, trying to put two and two together, well, he was hired to do it. He's coming up to trial next month. If that's true, somebody don't want their name to come out in this trial. And the only way to do that is get him out of jail or get quiet in the testimony somehow. So it made sense to me that somebody might have gotten to Vicky and said, if you don't do this, we're going to harm your family. We're going to do this or that. So that was my second line of defense, I guess, if you would, in defending Vicky. And then when I realized that wasn't the case, that she absolutely voluntarily took him out of there, it was just, it just was devastating for me personally that she would do that.
Does it hurt more knowing that this wasn't an impulsive thing, that they did have a developed relationship over the course of a few years?
I think so. And, people always talk about red flags. Should have seen the red flag. Well, there were red flags, but, typically we don't really see them as red flags until after the fact. I think back on it now, in the last 6 or 8 months, Vicky and the director and I always did interviews for new corrections deputies. Well, the last 4 or 5 interview sessions we had for applicants, Vicky wasn't there. She always had a reason why she couldn't be there. I think now, hindsight, I think she was avoiding me, because Vicky and I think, had a good relationship. I was told by investigators that she wanted to call me. The way it was presented to me, it was during the actual pursuit, while they were pursuing them in Evansville, Indiana, that she had wanted to call me. And, I don't know why, she would have wanted to talk to me. But the kind of relationship we had, I don't think it would have been anything other than tell me she's sorry. That's all I can imagine it would have been, because that's the Vicky I knew. I think it really would have bore on her conscience, especially seeing me on the news pleading with her to turn herself in and this sort of thing. I don't think I was the kind of boss. We've all had bosses in the past that we would have, thrown under the bus if we could have, but. We didn't have that kind of relationship. And if she felt that way toward me, she sure did a good job of hiding it. But I don't think that was the case at all.
Well, we tell people when it comes to manipulation that it is slow and subtle. We make sure that it's like something that, yes, I do believe manipulation is a two-way street. You have to allow it to happen for it to actually happen. But it is very slow and subtle. And it may take you a while to be aware of the game that's being played. But then, you're going to be asked to do something that you wouldn't normally do. And that's where it matters, because at that point here, now the game's been exposed. You could have this love thing going on, and you're sad, and maybe in your head you still believe the person cares for you. But once they ask you for something that makes you break away from your prescribed role, you have now officially are en route to make a decision that's going to affect the people that love you the most. I mean, it is a very technically selfish decision, but in their mind, they're choosing the new loyalty that they have with the individual who has cultivated it. And I believe in the course of that 2 years or whatever is before she eventually went ahead and committed to the assisting him with the escape, I think he was cultivating her. She did have some vulnerabilities that he was able to exploit, correct?
Absolutely. And I think, Vicky had a reputation among not just her coworkers, but among the inmates. She was fair to the inmates, but she was firm. I don't know how many inmates have told me since this happened that I've seen and talked to, especially when they got back out and out on the street, that, Vicky wouldn't she wouldn't, do anything that even slightly bent the rules to help them. So this was so unlike her. But I absolutely believe that, I'm sure the inmates probably talked about her, about if she'd be fair with you, she would, if she could help you, she would help you. That was the kind of person she was. But up until April the 22nd, or the couple of years leading up to that, she had never done anything out of bounds in that regard. She did what she could do legally and through the system. If they had good behavior or something, and that was going to be a factor, or if she would let the judge know, that, hey, they've been obeying the rules, they've been doing this, that, and, put in a word for them. But they liked her, they respected her. And I again, some of this is just mere speculation, but I'm thinking Casey White probably got wind of that the first day or two he was in our facility back in 2020. And realizing she was in the position she was in, specifically targeted her and started trying to develop a relationship with her, and, complimenting her. And, she's a single woman, hadn't been married in over 20 years, been divorced 20 years, and, paid her some attention, something that she was missing in her life. And, I think it just went from there.
I always tell people that when you move up, the target in your back becomes bigger because you have areas of responsibility that are under your control that now makes it easier for the inmate. Like, why am I going to go after an officer when I can go after a sergeant? Why am I going to go after a sergeant when I go after a lieutenant? Straight on up the chain. And when I always tell the supervisors that for inmates, you want to be approachable, but not always so accessible, because again, we have to protect that supervisor as well, because they have the ability to influence others on their staff. Like in this case here, she was a high rank position, was able to use her influence to unfortunately the rookie officer that may have been unfamiliar with policy, that automatically doesn't want to question a person that high up of a command, but also he may not feel that he's in a position to question a person that high up in command. But I saw in the book there's a picture of her as, like, I guess she's handing out mess or something, and he's able to give her a note. Would that be something that an officer or a person of that rank would actually be doing?
Not on an ordinary basis. She did from time to time. It all comes back. As I said, all this stuff comes full circle. We were very short-handed. She was not one to say, stand back and let the other take on the extra work. If she could do something to help the rank and file deputy, she's going to do it. And that is something she could do to help them out, to take part of that workload off of them when they're working overtime shifts and everything else, and they're getting burnt out. And she was just the kind of person pitch in there and do her part to help them. So it wasn't unusual for her to do that. It wasn't part of her normal duties or assigned duties. But being shorthanded, if that's something needed to be done, she wasn't above doing it.
And it's funny because I get it, being short-staffed. We want to do what we can to work with our people to make sure the job gets done. But then sometimes when we look back, hindsight being 2020, we wonder if there was a motive behind her wanting to do that. And out of curiosity, do you think that this could be the only inmate that she had at one time developed a relationship with, or do you think that maybe there were others in the past, or just, if not, what made Casey so different?
I think this is the only one. I think if there'd been other situations like this involving Vicky in the past, we've had other situations in the past not involving Vicky. In fact, Vicky is the one that helped us investigate. We had to terminate another female employee. Excuse me. We had information that she was having inappropriate relations with an inmate. But the only thing that was based on was there was a photograph of the inmate on, she was a sergeant, and it was a photo of an inmate on the sergeant's desk. And when I say she was a sergeant and the sergeant's desk, all four shift sergeants shared the same desk. So, but we were told was she's the one that put the picture there. It was just a mugshot of an inmate. And we brought in some of our vice officers and did some things undercover to try to determine, and we never could find any evidence that was actually going on. We found out when this guy was transferred out of our facility to a facility in Texas, about 3 or 4 weeks after that, we got informed by the authorities out in Texas that this particular sergeant had contacted this inmate via phone. And as soon as we found that out and had the recordings of the phone conversations, we terminated her. So it turned out it was legitimate, but you can't do anything until you've got the evidence.
And I wish.
But as far as Vicky, I think if there'd been other relationships, I think certainly that information would have come out, especially since they left. And I've not heard any word that there was ever another inmate in this situation with Vicky.
Yeah, and I wish people understand the importance of collecting evidence. I mean, sometimes they feel that we're collecting it too long, but we know that when it gets up to the higher levels, when it gets to the court system, I mean, the more you have on your side, the better. But if at any point you feel that the collecting of evidence can cause a risk to the facility, then you got to do what you can to act immediately. And to be honest with you, in this case here, it's unique that even though he, did manipulate her, I wonder if there was a way where he could have, this is all, guessing, but maybe he could have wanted a more violent approach, but maybe because of her respect to the facility, the respect to the people she worked with, maybe she could have came up with the idea that this would be the best way to do it with the least amount of people getting hurt. Again, I don't know. That's just up in the air. But so if we start with the journey from the very beginning and kind of just go right through, how did this work out? So she you got your first group of inmates going out for a court trip. So obviously, is there a memo or something that's given to the staff to let the staff know that these are the inmates that are going to be sent out to court that day, or was that not done?
Yeah, it was, but the list was sent to Vicky White. That was one of her duties and responsibilities. And, hindsight after this was all over and we looked at our policies and procedures, our policies were not as flawed. They weren't perfect, but they weren't as flawed as our procedures were. The job description for Vicky White, for the assistant director that I wrote, so that's totally on me, gave her too much authority and control. The two big mistakes, in my opinion, we made is we had a transport team assigned out of the detention center. Now, I did that when I went into office for this reason. We were having to call deputy sheriffs in off the road to transport inmates. Well, Lauderdale County is a big county, and when you've got 4 or 5 deputies working the whole county, and you have to pull 1 or 2 of them off the road to transport inmates, then calls start to get backed up. And people were complaining when I was running for sheriff that, you call the sheriff's office, it might take them 2 hours to get a deputy out there. So that was obviously something I wanted to address. So in my thinking, well, we can hire corrections deputies to do the transporting and let the regular road deputies stay out in the field. Having the transport team, and I could have done that, but where I made my mistake was assigning it to the jail, assigning them to work out of the jail with a corrections officer in charge of them. After this happened, we had a transport unit at the jail that handled local transports. We had a transport unit at the sheriff's office that handled extraditions and over the road transports. So we merged those two units into a single transport unit that worked out of the sheriff's office now. But that jail list, yes, it went to the jail, went to Vicky White. She's the only one that saw the list. In our procedures, we didn't have a procedure for her to share that list with anyone other than just to tell them these are the ones that need to go to jail. But as far as actually seeing the list, the courthouse and the jail is only two. She could have easily added a name to the list. You know, it'd been hard for take a name off of it because the judge was expecting them. But if she wanted to get somebody at that facility that wasn't on the jail list, all she had to do was add the name of the jail list and get them to the courthouse, get them out of the facility. But, of course, we had the policy, and she knew the policy better than anybody, that Casey White was to be transported by two sworn deputies. We made that change in 2020 when Casey was in our jail the first time. We got wind that he was planning an escape, and we corroborated some of that evidence by finding shanks in his cell. And so we had him shipped back, and that's when we changed our policy that anybody on that kind of charge would be transported by sworn deputies. We did have to call him in off the road, and she was aware of that, but she had already dispatched those two transport units out of the facility that morning, and then, claimed that he had to go up there for an evaluation. And so, there again, told the desk officer that she's going to carry him up there and drop him off because the other guys are already up there, and she's the only one that was firearm certified to do it. So,
yeah, and I was watching a few of the videos. I know sometimes when these court trips are requested, usually through word of mouth by phone, and there's really no documentation from whoever's making the request. It could be just a judge calling, and maybe that's because of the close connection you guys have with the jail. But it does make sense, if I may, where when you're planning a trip, you filter it to the highest level of custody to make sure everything's in play, at least safety and security wise, but you also cross your T's and dotted your I's to confirm that there is a court trip. I mean, that's a practice I'm very familiar with. If there's a court trip, classification forwards it over to admin reviews it, sends it over to the highest level of custody, and then custody then filters it out. My biggest concern here is not only did she oversee that, but she was also responsible for doing the transport. And now you start to see, wow, that's a tremendous conflict. So the person that's approving the list is now doing the transport, let alone that she's a female doing a male transport. I mean, I know hindsight's 2020, but for the rookie who was on the job a couple of months, were there any basics that we felt looking back that he should have been aware of, like maybe a female taking out a male, regardless of the rank? Was there any level of responsibility pushed towards him in letting her go out with the trip?
I said a little earlier, I don't think he probably even knew what the transport policy was. He hadn't been there very long at all. And, so I don't really think he even knew what that policy was. But, that was where our biggest flaws in our policy and procedures came in. I mean, I had absolutely given her too much authority, too much control in her job description, really, more so than the policies and procedures. And so anyway, I'm sorry, I got distracted there. Something come up on my
computer. It's okay. But I just want to mention, everybody at the public knows, it makes a lot of sense because that you give someone that amount of authority because they are your highest level of safety and security. I mean, at one point, when you're working with people that high of rank, I mean, there is a level of trust they have to have, or else they can't be at that high level of rank.
Yeah, if you don't trust them, they're not going to be in that position to start with. If you don't trust them, they're not going to be working there to start with.
Yeah, and you had no reason. We always tell people in corrections, at least when I'm working with people in administration, that I know this may sound a bit naive, but I'm not a micromanager. I have to know that the people that were in the position are trusted to be in that position, or like you said, why would they be in that position? And so I usually say, trust is automatic, distrust is earned. The hard thing about this profession is that if they make a mistake, the back end of the consequence could be so severe. But having said that, I wouldn't have that person in the position if I'm going to be doing their job. So having said that, it makes sense that you're sending this list to be reviewed by your highest level of safety and security. So again, I don't, at that point, I get that maybe there was a little bit of I think the flaw here was her doing the transport. But I also was reading, did she do transports before in her position as well?
No, she coordinated. Even when we have over the road transports or extraditions, that information comes through the sheriff's office, and it always has. And then the sheriff's office would contact the jail and inform them that inmate A, B, and C are going to be transported to the state correctional facility, and on this particular day. And they would get them ready. But of course, they didn't let the inmates know until the morning of. But it just we learned a lot through this about having better checks and balances, and those policies or those procedures are now in place since I've left office. We implemented them before I left, but the new sheriff has, of course, taken them up. But it'd be hard pressed for an event like this to happen again. I would never say it couldn't. It obviously could, but with the procedures we've got now that we put in place before I left, I think it'd be much more difficult for someone to pull something like this off.
Yeah, I have a book coming out in January or February. It talks about layers of security, and usually when it gets to an escape, there's so many layers that have been kind of violated or worked around. And I think that, for someone like Casey, he observes the layers, but then once you're able to connect to someone who's that high up, they eliminate the layers for you.
Yeah.
Because technically they're the ones that are like the final fail safe. So when you lose someone at that high of a level, your whole facility is jeopardized. That's why when you said, like, when they saw the escape, and it's like, wow, but when I found out that this wasn't just an officer and that she was able to walk out with the inmate, I said, it's got to be someone that's high ranking. It has to be someone that's high ranking just to be able to walk out with no questions being asked. And again, that was just something I thought of when I first started hearing this. Now, as we move forward, I just want to get past the jail part and start getting to the manhunt. But one last thing, I know they say that a lot of the inmates didn't say nothing, which is usually unique because most of the time they will say something because they also tend to get jealous of other inmates who have that connection to staff, because there's a level of power that shifts to some extent. So like if I'm able to corrupt this high level individual, then maybe there's some status that I get for doing that. But for some reason, a lot of inmates came out afterwards, including some employees, that said they weren't shocked by this. But yet, if that's the case, especially for the one employee that said something that wasn't shocked, my question would be, well, if you weren't shocked, why didn't you say something? What were the behaviors that you noticed that didn't shock you? So I hate when people say that, like, well, I wasn't shocked. I kind of knew something like this would happen. Well, okay, well then hindsight 2020. But if you're not shocked by it, then I'm going to ask you, why didn't you do something about it? But for the inmates who may have been more in the know, usually you would get a drop note, even something anonymous. Do you think that they could have been benefiting from this relationship as well, or were they scared to say something?
No, I think there's a couple of things. One, Casey White is a big man, and I think there was an intimidation factor there. As a matter of fact, some of the inmates were very, very reluctant to talk even after the escape, because they were concerned that Casey would end up back in that jail with them. But yes, they did come forward afterward. You mentioned a co-ed worker saying that they knew something like this would happen or was going to happen. That the one former employee that I'm aware of that made those comments was a disgruntled former employee who was terminated for excessive force on inmates, and he's anytime he's had an opportunity to attack the sheriff's office or the jail or me personally over the years, he's taken advantage of it, and he's he's the one that I heard and I'm aware of that was making those kind of comments about this case. You always have some disgruntled employees or former employees that are going to want to get their 2 cents worth in. But I don't know of any employee that was working at the time that said they saw something like this coming. It took everybody completely off guard, even our own family. No one saw this coming. So it's like you said, it's something. When I was chief of police in Florence, and I did the same thing when I was sheriff. I said, don't come into a staff meeting when we've got an employee issue and say where everybody knew it was going on. Because if everybody knew it was going on, I said, what you're telling me is you and other people have not done your job. That's one thing that was one of my pet peeves. Don't come in there and tell me what everybody knew was happening.
Because
somebody should have done something.
You're spot on, Sheriff, because to me, if you know it's happening, your number one job is to police something. And having said, the only reason why you're not is because you're afraid of conflict. Oh, what about if I'm wrong? Well, what about if you're right? So that disgruntled employee right off the bat, if I was doing the investigation, the moment that person said, well, I'm not shocked by it, okay, bring him to the table as well. I want to know what he knows, why he's not shocked about it, and either pull some truth out of him or – I just hate people that tend to say, oh, we knew. And then you're right. Don't make the effort to do anything about it. So let's go over the escape. So, okay. So she's able to get him out of the facility. What happens next?
Well, of course, it took about 6 hours for us to know they were gone. There again, she had arranged for both transport teams to be gone from the building. That left a skeleton crew working in the facility. We had a control room officer. We had a booking room officer. We had 2 hall deputies in the main facility working the halls. So that was 5 people, counting Vicky White, working inside the facility. She walked him out the door, told the booking officer that she was going to drop him off the courthouse to the other deputies. She was going to one of the local medical centers because she wasn't feeling well. And they left. Well, I didn't know the director tried to get in touch with Vicky a couple of 3 times that morning. She had turned in her retirement papers the day before, and she needed to do some follow-up work on that with the personnel office, and he was trying to get that message to her. And, found out that she had left and said she was sick and said, his final message was, I just heard that you had to go home sick. Hope you get to feeling better. And that was just before noon. And they'd already been gone now a couple of hours. When they realized that Casey was not back for lunch, was the first red flag that was picked up on. They thought, why is Casey not back? And of course, she had told him he was going up there for mental evaluations, which, those things sometimes take a few hours. So it wasn't a real urgent situation even then, but that was the first thing they realized something might be going on. And finally the booking sergeant contacted the other assistant administrator and told her, said, look, it's 3 o'clock now. She left at 9:30 this morning with Casey, carrying him to the courthouse for an evaluation. Nobody's seen or heard from him since. I've tried to call Vicky on her phone. It goes straight to voicemail. And that's when they called the sheriff's office and informed us that they were missing. That was about 3:30 that Friday afternoon.
Hey, Sheriff, can I ask a question? Or just
sure.
So she didn't have enough time to retire, correct? And I know one of the hindsight bias, whatever, one of the red flags was I think she only had 16 years and the retirement was very abrupt, correct?
Yeah, it sort of. She didn't have enough time in to draw her retirement. She hadn't enough. You vest with your retirement in Alabama in 10 years. So her retirement was vested, but she didn't have enough years in to actually draw a check. And she wasn't old enough to actually draw a check. Had she been old enough, even with a year of service, she could have went ahead and drawn a check. But she had been talking about retirement for 2 or 3 months. And, the director had informed me back in maybe January, before this happened in April, that she was talking about retiring. And, of course, he and I agreed, she's going to be hard to replace because she was such a good employee. And, we just kept wondering who in the world we're going to find to fill her shoes. And anyway, but she'd been talking about it off and on, but it was abrupt in that she walked in that Thursday and turned in her papers that Friday would be her last day, the very next day. And typically it takes about a month to get all that paperwork filled out and processed before you can even get it in. So that was what was sort of abrupt about it. We weren't caught off guard totally that she was going to retire, but she just really getting much notice that this is the day.
Right, and they mentioned something about her selling her house, spending the night with her family, and even going on a drive with the dog, which was also mentioned. I'm learning all this from the book, your wonderful book that you wrote. Did anybody question, or did they even know that she had sold her house?
Not that I know of. She might have mentioned it to some of them at the jail, but I don't think she had. She had, retiring. She'd been talking about maybe moving to the beach, and so I guess if she's gonna move, she'd have to sell it. But I don't think anyone was aware she'd actually sold it. She put it on the market in February. It actually sold fairly quickly. It actually auctioned off. So I think it was sold within a couple of weeks, but it took a few more weeks to get all the paperwork and so forth. So she didn't actually get her money until late March or early April.
And it's good to get that out there because your book explains it perfectly well, where I think a lot of people actually believed that when they look back, they see all these actions, but then they forget that, well, you have a context, you have an end result. So some of these things could be looked at as isolated at first because you don't have anything to bring it all together. But then you adding that, not everybody may have known that she sold the house, that, she had made money off it, and that was the last day she was going to see her family. I think the only thing that maybe is a slight red flag was the abrupt retirement, where people may close to her said, "Hey, what's going on? Are you okay?" And it's more of a mental wellness thing. We wouldn't necessarily go look to say, "Oh, you're retiring because you're going to go help an inmate escape." It'd be more like, "Hey, what happened? Is everything okay? Why are you just leaving all of a sudden?" If it was made clear that she was retiring, because I believe that they were understaffed and they were still trying to do something for her. But unfortunately, the facility was a little bit busy that day, and I think she didn't even eat the cake, they said, right?
Yeah. Vicky was a very private person. She didn't share a lot of her personal affairs with coworkers or, people she worked with or her own family even. But, she was pretty private. So it wouldn't be unusual for her to keep those kind of things to herself. And it wouldn't have, it was even a little out of character for her to even talk about any plans she might have had. I guess in conversation, it come up about the beach, and she maybe said, "Well, I'd like to retire down there one day," or something like that. But she was a very private person, so it would have been, there'd be very, very few people that she would have confided anything in, and even then, it'd be limited to what she would have told somebody.
Right, and then when they do the investigation, they're gone. We know that they're out. As I said, you've been made aware now. I mean, when you issue the investigation inside the facility, what do? You secure the cell? I mean, how does that play out?
Well, obviously the first thing we did, check the courthouse, started talking to inmates. That's when we started finding out a few of the details about this quote special relationship that they had. And the more we dug into it, we finally found out that relationship had been going on for 2 years since the very first time Casey was in our facility. That was in the summer of 2020, in the fall. And when he was there as part of the Connie Ridgway murder investigation, to work with the investigators and to do interviews and talk to them about that case, we found out he was going to escape, send him back. Well, we found out later they had been communicating by phone while he was in prison between that time and the second time he came to our facility, which was, I guess the summer of 21. And that was for at the request of his attorney. And after that second stay, and until he came back on February the 25th of 29th of 2022, that during that period of time, they made close to 1,000 phone calls, conversations with each other as an average of 4 times a day. So I imagine it's good morning, good night, and a couple of calls in between. But so she obviously was making some of those calls probably from the job. She had burner phone. The marshals called it her bad girl phone because that's the phone she did all this business on. It wasn't a phone number anybody else had. We didn't have it at the office. None of her coworkers had it. Nobody knew she had that phone. But they found that phone, and that phone pinged up in Tennessee the second night they were gone, that Saturday night after they left on Friday. And we felt like that was, now hindsight, back to hindsight, it was about 15 miles from where we found the Ford Edge was abandoned. So I think it was probably a legitimate lead that night, but it was like it was a mountainous area, a lot of woods, very remote. So we had no luck trying to locate them based on that ping. We didn't have a specific enough location to pin them down, but I think that was probably a legitimate lead that night.
Yeah, and then so what happens? I guess moving forward now, I know at one point they had the car that they tried to paint over. I guess because everybody kind of knew what the first car was that they got into after they got out of the official professional vehicle.
Yeah, I think of course, they had abandoned that car before we even knew they were gone. And I understand that Casey was upset by the bright orange color and wanted to camouflage it somehow. And that's when they decided just to abandon it and get something different. But excuse me, but so they went on. Actually, that first 7 days, we really didn't have anything to go on. We did finally get the Ford Edge positively identified as a car that she bought for them to leave Florence in. It was a week later before we found that car, and it had been sitting there in that record lot every day since they had left. They abandoned it within 4 hours of when they left the building.
Right, and I noticed eventually later on, this gentleman plays a very important role in helping us find the Casey White and Vicky White. What was his role?
James Stinson. He managed the car wash up in Evansville, and that's just where they found the pickup truck that they bought in Spring Hill, Tennessee. The truck was left parked in his car wash, and the window was down, and the keys were in it. Obviously, Casey was hoping someone would steal it because the truck wasn't stolen; it was purchased. And if somebody had taken that truck, they might still be driving it today. But the manager there, Mr. Stinson, he saw it. He called the local police, which he didn't have to do. He could have just had it towed. It was on his lot. All he had to do is call a wrecker. But he called the police because he thought something was suspicious about it. And they came out and ran the truck. And of course, it came back clean on NCIC. So they informed him, according to the law, they couldn't have it towed his own private property, but he could. So he had it towed. But because the officer from Evansville Police Department that went out there and took that report or took that call, he ran the VIN number on NCIC. And when the marshals were able to get a hold of that VIN number, that was on Tuesday, I think, that it was abandoned at the car wash. Well, that following Friday is when we found the Ford Edge, identified the truck, got the VIN number. And so Saturday, they started doing the queries on NCIC to see if the VIN number had been run. And Sunday afternoon found that it had been run in Evansville, Indiana. And that's what led the investigators to Evansville.
And I think I've read in your book too. They mentioned that at one point they didn't want to leak the type of car, but eventually, unfortunately, it was leaked. But then it turned out to be a blessing in disguise.
Absolutely. We had nothing to go on. That first 7 days, we had no leads whatsoever. We did finally get a description of the vehicle they left in. Within 4 hours after we got that information, it was out to the public. Inadvertently released by another law enforcement agency. We went ahead and pushed it out to all the media then since it was already out anyway. And the first real lead we got was the following Friday. They'd been gone a full week. And we found that Ford Edge, identified the truck. And once we got our hands on that Ford Edge, we knew what direction they were headed. And within 72 hours, they were in custody.
Yeah, that's why I jumped ahead to the owner of the car wash, because I in the book there is a lot of dead time in between. There were some rumor mills as well that he was being pushed in a wheelchair by her, dressed as a woman. I don't know if that was true. And that there was someone I watched on an interview that said that the pictures that they showed of Vicky White was very filtered, that she looked a lot older than 57, and that they basically said that if she would have just dressed as a very older woman, she could have walked right by you and you would have never known it was her. Is that true?
Very possibly. I mean, no, she would have blended in much more than Casey. Casey was so tall that I was asked the question about the wheelchair at a press interview with one of the local, one of the national press affiliates, and asked me if I'd heard or we'd heard that he was being disguised, and of course my response was I hadn't heard it at the time, and my response was that, you know, even if he was in a wheelchair, his knees were going to be up under his chin. So I mean, you know, that's not going to help disguise him too much. But when I went back to the war room and talked to the marshals and briefed them on the questions I was asked at the press meeting, I asked them, I said, I told them I was asked this question about his wheelchair, and they looked at each other and said they'd gotten a tip about that less than 2 hours earlier. So it got out to the press pretty quick. I don't know how that information got out, but you know, in those situations, you know, people talk, and sometimes there's things you want to hold close to your chest because you don't want it out there.
Right.
That was the case in the Fort Edge to start with, but as I said, once that word actually got out, it actually turned out to help us because we did find the Fort Edge, and that was the first lead we got. We knew they left here and went north. That's all we knew on that. A week later, we knew they left here and went north.
Thanks to that gentleman right there. What was his name again?
James Stinson. And that's Ellie doing the interviewing with a local TV station there in Evansville, Indiana. James, he really took an interest in this case. He and his brother made several trips here to Florence. They came down to Forever Hearing, I guess there was, for Casey. They just really got involved with it. Once he unintentionally got involved like he did by identifying that truck, they really followed the case closely.
As we get closer to the capture, what happens the night before? Do they find I know as you said, they find a vehicle near what's the hotel or motel?
The video footage from the car wash, they were able to identify a Cadillac that Vicky was driving, and they were able to get that tag number off of a flat camera on the highways and trace that Cadillac back and get the information on it and get the tag number and so forth. So anyway, that's what led them to the motel. There again, you know, they made a lot of mistakes, I guess. I started to say foolish mistakes, but mistakes. The Fort Edge, they abandoned it on a county road at an intersection. And, you know, it so happened that a local parent whose child rode the bus saw it sitting there and knew the bus would have a hard time making that turn with that car sitting there. So she called the sheriff's office and they had it towed off. If they'd parked that car 5 miles away in Walmart's parking lot over in Spring Hill, you know, who knows how long it was set there before it was noticed. You know, the same way with the motel. I mean, the room they were in was right there on the front, facing the main highway, and the car's parked right in front of the door. If it had been parked in the back of the motel, may not have, I don't know if they wouldn't have seen that. So, you know, they made a lot of missteps that helped us, that's for sure.
Yeah, and again, guys, we get a chance to book details it very well. And then we finally get to the capture. You know, I mean, here we are. We got pictures. There they are. And you got some good pictures of Casey kind of being slammed down by the police officers, which is good. Put handcuffs on this dangerous individual. But what was how did this day roll out?
Well, it was the best phone call I got during the whole 11 days when they called and told me they had him in custody. Of course, I wasn't thrilled to hear about Vicky's situation. You know, my first word was that she'd been shot in the head, apparently self-inflicted. Well, the first I heard, didn't know who shot her, if it was an officer, if it was Casey, or Vicky shot herself. But anyway, you know, of course, I was hoping she would pull through it. I wouldn't have wished that on her for anything, but even under the circumstances. But Of course, she succumbed to those injuries. Casey got back, and we brought it. He got it here about 10:30 that Tuesday night. He was arraigned immediately before the judge, and then transported directly on to Donaldson Prison, and that's where he's been ever since.
Yeah, and he was quick to say when he got out that during the time when he got out from the vehicle, he was quick to say that he didn't shoot her. At least that's what's noted in what we read. And I tell people, sometimes it's hard to separate the person from what they've done. And I do believe during her funeral, there were staff there that attended, because at the end of the day, she wasn't just their boss. She wasn't just an officer. She was Vicky, so they knew her. And I get the conflict of that. I get the conflict of not being able to separate somebody from what they've done and still seeing that individual. And I thought that's kind of like, it's the conflict of it all. At the end of the day, it's still a person who I know she is seen as the person that helped assist in the escape, but there's a lot of people that still see her as a victim. That he played her because she was vulnerable. And at that point, again, it's not to minimize the responsibility of what she's done, but really to understand how manipulative someone could be. They take advantage of someone's vulnerabilities. And at that point, that person is a victim, but unfortunately they committed a crime that, you just can't escape the responsibility from. But did you see her as both a victim and an offender?
I do. I do. I think she was a victim of his manipulation, and of course, he convinced her to do something she obviously should not have done, and she would have had to face the consequences of that had she lived and survived. But it's easy when you don't know the parties involved to sit back and make judgments. But when you know, at least one of the parties involved very well and know them the way we knew Vicky, it's very, very difficult to look at them as anything other than a victim, really. It's harder to see someone that you really know as an offender because you knew the person before. And, as I said, this one event in Vicky's career, a 17-year unblemished career, except for this one incident. And it's just hard to really, I guess, see her through the lens of an offender, as being an offender totally.
And I got one more video before we wrap it up, just more related to the capture.
We begin with breaking news overnight. There was a dramatic end to the manhunt for an Alabama inmate and the corrections official accused of helping him escape. Police cornered Casey White and Vicky White, no relation, after a 15-minute car chase in Evansville, Indiana. Casey White, an accused murderer, surrendered. Authorities say that Vicky White shot herself in the head. She later died from that injury. Chris Davis of our Nashville affiliate, that's WTVF, is outside the sheriff's office in Evansville with more on this story. Chris, this was an amazing end to the story that the country was watching. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Gail. Quite the story indeed. This search lasted nearly 2 weeks. We spoke to a deputy with the U.S. Marshals Service who leads the investigation. He shared new details about how these two were finally caught.
Casey quickly surrendered, and his immediate words to our team was, please help my wife. She just shot herself in the head.
U.S. Marshals say there is no evidence Casey and Vicky White were ever married, but their capture brings a stunning end to a manhunt that captivated the country for nearly 2 weeks. Law enforcement collided with their third getaway car, a gray Cadillac, in Evansville, Indiana. U.S. Deputy Marshal Chad Hunt is the commander of the Gulf Coast Regional Fugitive Task Force.
There are several tragedies, to this story, the way this escape ended, but also too, it stings that somebody entrusted with what she was given as a correctional officer planned, organized, and facilitated this escape.
Vicky White died in the hospital hours later. It all started on April 29th. Authorities say this surveillance video shows Officer White leading the inmate to her patrol car outside the jail in Lauderdale County, Alabama. Police say they ditched it for this 2007 Ford Edge, which she allegedly bought under an alias. It was found abandoned in Tennessee last week. Before the duo was caught in Indiana, a tip led the Marshal Service to release these images, surveillance photos of a man they believed to be Casey White at an Evansville car wash last Tuesday. They say he abandoned that vehicle, a 2006 Ford F-150, there.
Visiting with the car wash owner and some additional surveillance footage that led us to believe that they were in this gray Cadillac.
From there, Deputy Marshal Hunt says law enforcement swept the area for that car. They found it at a nearby hotel where Vicky White was spotted wearing a wig as she left with Casey White Monday. That discovery turned into a 15-minute chase that culminated in their capture. Nearly 300 miles from the jail, they fled together. Back in Alabama, Lauderdale County Sheriff Rick Singleton made this promise about Casey White.
He's not getting out of this jail again. I'll assure you that.
Now, as for Casey White, he is expected to face capital murder charges later this month back in Alabama. As for Vicky's death, it poses a question that we may never truly get an answer to. How does a suspected murderer with a criminal past convince a corrections director in good standing to help him escape? Tony?
That is the big question. Chris Davis from our Nashville affiliate WTVF. Chris, thank you.
You know, real quick, I know you made some policy changes in the facility. You touched on them before. And I know that, I don't know if she had many interactions with him in the jail setting itself. I don't know if those interactions would be documented, like an officer putting how many times she comes down into the unit and if there would be a concern. But I'm sure if she's probably, you know, you're very understaffed, there'd be many reasons that she could be entering that unit for, not particularly just to see the inmate, but because maybe it's part of her daily routine and, you know, it's just another interaction. So I think that maybe they did keep it kind of low inside the jail setting, but most of the time, I'm sure they lived out whatever fantasies they could through the phone calls. I'm sure, I don't think there was something so obvious that was being done in the unit outside of even if there was frequent interactions. But some of the changes that you made, you said were to transportation, but anything with policy changes within the prison setting in regards to maybe logging in. I don't know. As I said, did she visit the unit a lot? Maybe do something with that. People have to be, are they logged in when they go to the unit, especially if they're going to the unit to see an inmate? I mean, are there procedures in place for that?
Well, a lot of procedures we'd like to change, we're not able to, because one thing that you well know, someone like Casey White, who's facing capital murder and already serving time for attempted murder and waiting trial for a capital murder, should never be put in population. They should be in isolation under 24/7 surveillance, and that facility does not have that capability. So there's still a lot of issues within the facility itself that can only be eradicated or addressed with the building of a new facility, something that I've been pushed for the 7 years that out of the 8 that I was sheriff. The county's outgrown that facility. It's obsolete. It's poorly designed. The previous escapes we had from that facility were design flaws. The plumbing chases are actually inside the cell blocks, and they were able to get into the plumb chases, get up into the attic, onto the roof, and over the wire. We addressed that issue 2 or 3 times. It's sort of like the case up in Pennsylvania. They, when the guy scaled the wall, they thought they had that fixed. Then another guy scales the wall. Well, we thought we'd fix this problem, and then we had another escape, and they found another way to get in there, and so we finally got it fixed. The last time I had a breakout was 2016. But you think there are just some things that you're limited. The comment I made, he'll never get out of this jail again. One reason, because he'll never be back in that jail again. Every time we made arrangements with the Department of Corrections, and they made a special exception for us for Casey White, that anytime he came to court in Lauderdale County, we went down, picked him up that morning, brought him to court, turned around, carried him right back to Donaldson. Right. Every court appearance he's made since this escape, that's the way it was handled. But it just there are lots of things that need to be done still in the Lauderdale County Detention Center that are just not feasible with the facility we've got. Right. Until the county commission builds a new facility, a lot of those issues are going to remain unaddressed.
I just wish, because we do have these great developed partnerships between counties and state, or we should. I just wish that we could be more preventive in that. So if we don't have the room, then let's reach out to the state prior and see if they can assist, because I'm used to that type of relationship where
Yeah.
if the county, moment they get the inmate, they don't feel that they could be safely housed, or if they feel that, hey, this person requires a maximum unit, but unfortunately, I also got to provide them with yard and all these other things. Let's go ahead and send them over to the state, who's more able to facilitate the needs. Because that's one of the big concerns I think a lot of people don't realize is that you can't just isolate. They got to give them yard. You got to give them a couple other things. So having said that, sometimes the county and their highest level of restriction can't do those things. And that's where the state can come in, and we kind of operate on that all the time, where the highest level of restrictions are still giving what they're supposed to get, yard, rec, all those other things.
And we always had a good working relationship with our neighboring counties. If we had high profile inmates that needed to be in a facility other than ours, that we would make arrangements for them to keep in their facility and vice versa. The problem with the state is that we have a state prison within 60 miles of Lauderdale County. But the problem with the state prisons is, and that's why Casey ended up back in our facility both times, was because the prison rules forbade their attorneys from bringing computers and things into the prison to show their clients evidence and stuff that, on the computers. And so Casey's attorney petitioned the court to have him brought back to Lauderdale County so he could have access to his client to prepare for trial. And, so that's not something the state could have helped us with it if they'd have just let the attorney in with the equipment, but that was a violation of their policies. So, it just, it's like I said, when something like this happens, you can look back and say, well, shoulda, oughta, shoulda, coulda, woulda. But, it's, when you're looking ahead and not looking back, we knew he had planned an escape. We were prepared for that. We'd made necessary changes. We put the staff on high alert when he was here the second time. Then he came back the third time to get ready to actually go to his trial, and that's when this happened. So,
well, you always have the context when you look back, and then basically it kind of gives you the answers you need, and it's like, well, it's again, but we didn't know at that time, what this plan was. So I get it 100%. For us, if we do deal with inmates, let's say from county, we do abide by the county contracts. As long as we could safely carry them out. Same thing if we have like a federal inmate. They may be housed with us, but the feds are very on top of how they're being treated in the system, and we do stay in compliant with the federal guidelines because it's within the contract. We can't violate that. Just as we wrap up, do you have anything you'd like to say in closing? I just want to mention the book was a great read. It was quick and informative. I like books like that because, again, you lived it. I don't want to hear the story from anybody else but you, to be honest with you. So once I knew the book was out, I reached out to a friend of mine, Brian Roback, who has always been a supporter of what I do. And I know this was kind of last minute, but you were willing to come on the show immediately. And the reason why I think it's important is because, one, it is a story that can teach our staff a lot about the manipulation process, which I think we should be more aware of. So I'm very attracted to these types of stories. But second, there's a lot of people that watch this channel that kind of don't understand the complexities of the day-to-day. They're quick to pass judgment, and they don't realize that sometimes we're put in positions where we got to make sacrifices, and it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't, but you still got to make a decision. You can't freeze. And that kind of, leads us to where we're at now in corrections. Corrections is very understaffed nationally, and I can't think of any facility right now that's operating at the highest level of effectiveness. My biggest concern with that is that when you start losing senior staff and the new staff coming in, they don't know what that highest level of potential is, and they start accepting the lower level as being the most effective. And I think, to me, it's just good to get it out there for people that may be watching this, that, hey, guys, if you get a chance, really look at your policies and make sure they connect well with your procedures, because if they don't, I think it's time that you got to kind of do a self-audit. My biggest concern, again, in corrections is more that we've been practicing, or we've been training practice as opposed to what is policy and procedure. Hey, so you have anything like to say in closing, Sheriff?
Well, yeah, just first of all, in your opening, you talked about manipulation and the fact that, and I think I made the comment in my book that if Vicky White could be manipulated like this, anybody is susceptible to it. I appreciate what you do to help to educate our corrections staff across the country. They have a tremendous responsibility and job. I have the utmost respect and admiration for them. Matter of fact, I dedicated my book to the corrections officers across the country because they're underappreciated, underpaid, and overworked, if anybody ever was. And I have the highest level of respect for corrections officers. Another thing that you mentioned that I think probably was a part of our situation, we do get complacent. Especially around people you're comfortable with being around. And when you're comfortable being around someone like Vicky, like I was, had total trust in her, had total confidence in her. Sometimes those red flags, even if we see them, we're blinded to them. We just take it or brush it off as something, insignificant. So my word would be in support of what you said is these corrections officers across the country, don't think it can happen to you. Be on guard, be ready for it, be mentally prepared for it because it's coming. I'd be shocked if any corrections officer that's worked at least a week in a corrections facility hadn't been approached about bringing contraband into a jail. It's going to happen. Be prepared for it. Be mentally prepared for it, and stand your ground because that you're going to have to let them know who's in charge. And I appreciate you, Anthony. Appreciate you having me on. And this was a very difficult 11 days in my career that spanned 5 decades, and I certainly wouldn't want to relive it again. That's for sure. But I've always believed in being transparent and honest about about what goes on, and this. There were a lot of things that could have been done that might have prevented this from happening, but at the end of the day, it is what it is. It happened. You just have to deal with what you got, and that's what we tried to do the best of our ability during that 11 days.
Yeah, and I'm going to tell you something. Just kind of looking back at the story, I love the transparency. I believe that, we all make mistakes. Unfortunately, in corrections, the mistakes have great consequences. But then when you get people coming on the air and being honest and actually really focusing on fixing the problem as opposed to their own pride, true changes occur. That's why I believe in the efforts that were made afterwards, because there was truth throughout the journey here. Basically, this is where we're vulnerable. This is where we need to address matters. And I wish that we do have more leaders who are willing to step up, swallow their pride, and hey, let's fix what the concerns are, because no one in corrections has a perfect career. Some are going to be small mistakes. Fortunately, some could turn out to be big mistakes. But at the end of the day, you're managing people who manage people who manage people. And when you're dealing with people, everything could be so unpredictable because there's developed relationships that you just, basically, I just want the end dialogue to be here. It's like I wrote a book on manipulation because it's not so much outcome driven. It's the process. It's the process of what's developed that leads to the outcome. A lot of people will say, well, it can't happen to me. I'll never bring in a watch. I'll never bring in this. It's like, yeah, but it's not about the outcome. It's about what's developed. And in corrections, because we have access to more inmates on a daily basis, there are chances where relationships can be developed. And it really starts where people become too personal. And then the inmate takes a chance to pull that person out of their prescribed role. So at the end of the day, I do believe in the label of inmate because it's the reminder of us that, yes, if that person's an inmate, then I'm an officer. It puts us right back into that professional label. And again, to have a chance to discuss the story here, to remind people that, yeah, it doesn't matter the level you're at. If anything, you got to protect yourself more because of the responsibility you have towards others, but ultimately the responsibility you have at that highest level to protect the house. So at the end of the day, I could see myself in your shoes feeling betrayed because I do trust my people. And if I found out that someone I trust at that highest of levels failed me, I don't know if I'd be able to recover from that. I don't know if I'd be able to recover from that. So as always, guys, the show is Tear. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify every time I post up a video. Stay safe.